Managing Director of Meridian West. Welcome to the first in our series of 4 Thought Leadership Megatrends webinars covering topics such as the future of work, purpose-led organizations, ESG, and digital transformation. For nearly 20 years now, Meridian West has been working on thought leadership campaigns for leading professional services, financial services, and B2B organizations. Over the last 2 decades, we've seen the topics of thought leadership change. But what we wanted to do this year was bring to the fore 4 topics, 4 megatrends that we think will be dominating the thought leadership agenda for 2021 and beyond. So the future of work, today's topic. We know that work has been central, if you like, to the history of ideas for a very long time. To put this in a little bit of context, you can go right back to classical philosophy, the likes of Plato, who talks about the ideal society, how that should be organized, what the relationship of work to the state or to society looks like. And we can trace this thinking right through the early modern period, through the Enlightenment and into the 18th and 19th century, where a lot of the conversation was driven by the industrialization, the first real wave of industrialization of the workforce, what that meant for the kinds of jobs and roles that people were taking on, and then into the 20th century, addressing things like the role of women in the workplace, and as technology advanced with computing power and new technologies, what that meant for the nature of work. In many cases, the discourse has been shaped around what the value of work has been, how do we navigate the relationship between employees and employers, and what is a fair and just way of valuing the contribution of individuals within work. So we've seen this trend continue into the 21st century, with many thinkers taking on the mantle, talking about what work may look like in an age of automation, how advances in technology, which have been accelerating in recent years, will change the kinds of jobs available, the kinds of skills that the workforce will need for the future, and what that means for wider society, thinking as well about trends like the gig economy. And most commonly, perhaps, we've seen that in books like Thomas Piketty's Capital in the 21st Century, which is one of the kind of big breakthrough books thinking on these issues in the last few years. And we've seen that reflected in thought leadership as well. A lot of conversation around the changing role of different in-house functions, disruption within different business sectors, and trying to think about what that means for being effective in the new world of work. And that was even before COVID came along. Obviously, with the arrival of COVID, it's put a real focus on work. And we've seen that there's been a general debate considering big questions: which jobs do we value? Who is an essential worker? And how do we value them? How do we remunerate essential work? But also people are using the opportunity of COVID to rethink some big trends. Will this be a moment where we look back and say work transformed forever? Or will we actually revert to how things largely took place in a pre-COVID working world once everybody has been vaccinated? There are some bigger questions around what this means for the city, what this means for skills and roles needed in a new world of work. We see this reflected day to day at the moment in lots of the commentary, particularly in the media. But it's also reflected in a lot of the thought leadership output from many of the leading professional firms. Unsurprisingly, many have microsites and resources dedicated to future work topics. McKinsey, for example, has done an interesting deep dive into a range of different jobs, identifying particular tasks that can be automated, what the impact of that might be for a remote workforce for the future. We see organizations like JLL thinking about what the future of work means in a real estate context. And Deloitte even has a escape room that it offers, although in the current circumstances, I don't know whether that's virtual, but essentially a kind of workshop where they get people to come together and think about how disruption could impact a fictional client in an escape room type scenario. So lots of focus around the future of work in a thought leadership context. It's also a topic that lends itself to many different types of conversations, talking about, for example, workplace culture and well-being, operational resilience, purpose and strategy, as well as some of the more obvious angles around talents and skills, technology and automation, and real estate requirements. So I think all professional firms in some way have an opportunity to comment on the changing world of work, what it means for the different sectors of the economy that they work with, what it means for their own business, and what it means for their relationships with clients. So I'll now hand over to Matt, who will introduce our panel. We're going to dissect some of the issues around the future of work for us. Over to you, Matt.
Following on from Alastair's introduction, I think the largest shift we have seen, the Office for National Statistics reported in April that a staggering 46.6% of the UK workforce was actually working from home at that particular point in time. It was the fastest shift in working demographic I think we've ever seen. And it has, as Alastair has intimated, raised some really interesting questions and discussions. And that's why we're absolutely thrilled today to introduce three really interesting speakers. We've got James Norton, who leads the Central London Office Research Team for JLL. We've got Kimberly Bradshaw, the Chief Executive Officer from Spotlight HR, who's going to talk on productivity, health and well-being. And we've got Tom Dobree, who leads the Graduate and Early Careers team at Freshminds, a recruitment consultancy, who's going to share his thoughts on what the workforce of tomorrow will expect and want from the workplace. But before we sort of get into the nitty gritty, I thought as a way of just introducing our speakers, we thought maybe let's ask them if they're working from home and when they expect to get back into the office. So James, I'm guessing you are still working from home, but when do you expect to get back to the office?
Yeah, correct. I'm indeed in a spare bedroom. I personally expect to be back in the office from around September. Perhaps it sounds a little bit negative, but seems realistic given the rollout of the vaccine. And to answer the second part of your question, I don't plan to return full time. I'll probably continue on a fairly flexible basis, doing 3 days out of 5 in the office.
Kimberly?
Well, I haven't been to my office for nearly a year, and I have been very successfully working from home and enjoying it. So I think I've been thinking, will I keep my office going forward, or will I look at a new approach? And no doubt we'll hear more about that from James in a minute.
Tom?
Yeah, well, I was being a little bit more optimistic, I think, than James. He's the expert on these things. So I think I was hopefully planning sometime in the summer. But I think either way, we'll probably be looking more at sort of 2 or 3 days a week whenever that does come.
And Alastair, does that ring true with you at Meridian West as well?
I think it does. I'd be surprised if we're back any time before the summer.
Yeah. So it's quite interesting, isn't it? It's the common thread there. And I suspect for many of us on the webinar, it's going to be exactly the same. We're working from home and expecting to go back to work, not full time, maybe 2 to 3 days a week, which is perhaps why JLL have spent quite a bit of time over the last few months and possibly the whole year conducting extensive research into the future of work. And I think a campaign was a thought leadership program was launched earlier this year, James, which I wonder if you wouldn't mind very briefly sharing some of the headlines from that campaign.
Yeah, happy to. I mean, as you say, this research was put together as a direct response to what's happened during COVID. As you know, we're all in the midst of the largest ever global home working experiment. And I think the surprise for most of us is to a large extent, it has been a success, at least on a practical level. So that raises the question, what does the future of the office look like? And some commentators have even questioned whether this is the start of the death of the office. I don't include myself in that group. So to answer that question for our clients, who are predominantly occupiers of office space and investors, we surveyed CRE leaders within large organisations, 160 of those across Europe. And also globally, we did a survey of employees, 3,000 respondents there, alongside the collective expertise of our research team and also our office specialists within JLL. So in terms of the key findings, broadly speaking, it hangs around 6 key trends which we think will shape the future of the office. But before I touch on them, I think it's worth noting these trends were already apparent prior to COVID. And we identified those previously in some of our other reports. Workspace Reworked, published a couple of years back. So really, for me, it's an acceleration of existing themes rather than completely new themes in themselves. So the first theme being remote working, of course, not a surprise. We don't expect a wholesale shift to full-time home working, but we do feel a more hybrid approach will emerge, as we've already kind of alluded to there. That will have major knock-on effects on the second theme, which is office design. We think it'll be much more focused around collaboration rather than fixed desks, as well as amenity within the building. Office density, I think, will be challenged by some organisations. Do we need as much office space as we did previously? And I think it's not quite as simple as I'm working from home 3 days a week, therefore we don't need the same amount of office space. There's new management challenges that are going to emerge, such as how do you manage, which days people are in the office. I can imagine a situation where everyone's off on a Friday, as an example. Technology absolutely will play a key part in the future of the office. More integration of video conferencing within meeting rooms, for example. Using smart technology to manage how people are using the office, and also things like contactless entry, I think, as an impact of COVID. I think the kind of immediate surrounds of an office, local amenities and green space will come into focus. Let's not forget the presence of these amenities are why we work in urban environments in the first place. That really attractive level of amenity is why we all move into work in London, for example. And I think that'll become increasingly important given that we're going to be in the office potentially less than we have been previously. And finally, commuting patterns. Less days in the office means really a longer commute becomes much more viable. And our expectation is that locations around major commuter hubs may come into focus, and a potential hub and club approach may be adopted by some larger organisations with a city centre HQ complemented by smaller, more flexible local offices. So that's a kind of summary of the 6 key themes that the report covers.
Do you think we're likely to see, keeping in mind the audience on this webinar is largely professional services firms, do you think we're likely to see the end of the trophy office as that sort of corporate headquarter?
I think it's an interesting question. I mean, the word trophy is kind of subjective, but I would interpret it as a building with a best-in-class amenity, both in terms of the building surrounds and also a way for the occupier to project their brand. I would say no. I'd say actually the opposite would be true. I feel, one of the things we were seeing pre-COVID and we expect to continue is a flight to quality. And I think that will be particularly prevalent if a hybrid model does emerge and we see people in the office less. I think the quality of the office will come into focus. The employee experience will become much more important. So I would expect much more emphasis on quality spaces that facilitate collaboration and creativity. So within the building, health and well-being, the air quality, ventilation, access to outside space and exercise facilities will come into focus. And outside the building, access to green space and that strong amenity that I mentioned before will come into focus. That was backed up by that survey I mentioned of 160 real estate leaders. 50% of those respondents thought they would see more high quality space in their portfolios, and the same number of respondents thought that they'd see less lower quality space. So, but to finish here, I think I've talked about some of the features that will underpin a trophy building. For me, I think one of the other mega trends that I think you're going to talk about in another seminar is sustainability. After all, real estate accounts for 40% of carbon dioxide emissions. I feel that could become the standout feature in buildings, which will come into focus, particularly given the large number of corporates, organisations signing up for really ambitious net zero carbon targets. There are no existing buildings in London actually that meet that net zero carbon criteria currently. So there's a real imbalance between supply and demand, and I feel that could be a real key driver and perhaps a different focus for a trophy building in the future.
It's also quite interesting. I mean, the office space itself doesn't sit in isolation of its surroundings, sort of the high street or the business park, and that tends to sort of support quite a wider infrastructure of retail, leisure, and hospitality. With the changing working sort of patterns that you've alluded to, how do you see that impacting the high street and the businesses that the office workers support? And it'd be quite interesting maybe to bring Kimberly and Tom in here as well.
Yeah, so I think that's a really, really important point to highlight. The trends I kind of mentioned earlier undoubtedly will have a major impact on London's economic geography, as you say, beyond office space. And I think the overall quality of the neighbourhood, the high street, the infrastructure will become much, much more important. For me, in the offices sphere, we could see an acceleration of offices being delivered in large-scale campus developments, which, due to their scale, can to some extent curate the kind of amenity offer, the retail offer, and just they can almost subsidise that, to attract in the office occupiers, rather than using the retail and amenity offer to generate revenue in their own right. So I think we could easily see winners and losers in London, and the hub areas I mentioned, the transport hubs could really benefit here. Mm-hmm. The other benefit, I think, could be a boost to some local high streets, particularly where there are homes of big commuter populations. If people are spending obviously more time at home, that potentially that kind of discretionary spend could be diverted to some other parts of the country away from central London, where it's traditionally gone. And as a final point, if that hub and club model I mentioned does emerge, then the locations that are homes of the smaller, flexible hubs could also be potential beneficiaries here.
Kimberly, I've a question for you. I mean, this shift is going to have a major impact on the management of people that these businesses employ, and putting aside sort of some of the technical sort of things like policies and all of those kinds of things. I think it'd be really interesting to have your thoughts on how it's sort of how you're seeing it affect creativity and productivity in professional services firms.
I think there's been a bit of a change in shift as well, if I could just address that quickly. The HR director of a FTSE 100 said a couple of months ago that you're not going to be able to call HR fluffy after this. And whilst I think it was in part referring to the constant change of regulations, guidelines, timings, I think also it speaks to a much more a much more strategic approach to HR. So rather than being more technical and operational, it's very much about building HR around the business goals, and then that leads into strategy for the specific HR strategies, such as reward or something. Picking up on what you asked about productivity, there's many reports out there. I know Expert HR did one, there'll be others that I've seen as well, who have said that productivity, despite the negative press, has actually increased. So both performance and productivity has changed. And the key factors behind that seem to be they've been well led, well managed, and they've utilised technology effectively. And I think that's a key lesson for the future of work. Mm-hmm. The skills that seem to be most prevalent in order to be successful in leaders and managers has been very much putting people first. And this, again, speaks to the HR strategic approach. And I think that's very much a main trend that should continue, whether it will or not as we go back to our next new normal, I don't know. Mm-hmm. Communications has evolved. Obviously, technology has enabled that, Zooms, Teams, things like that. But people have really focused on communicating more. There's been an all in it together type approach. There've been town hall type meetings with CEOs, just they're doing a sort of PMQ type thing, just so that everybody knows, everyone's open and transparent, and everyone feels involved and supported. Another trend which I've seen, and I think which will go forward, is how individual and organisational performance will be managed. There's been a big call during the last year to focus less on the numbers and the operational side and focus more on the human impact. And that leads in very much to what James was talking about with the office.
I mean, that also leads very much into the next question I was going to ask you, which is very much about health and well-being, and particularly mental health and well-being, and the impact. I mean, working from home, it can be quite an isolating experience, particularly if you're juggling childcare and maybe a partner who's also working as well. What observations have you seen around that, and how are businesses responding to sort of that increased human side to the workforce and managing health and well-being?
I think every cloud has a silver lining, and one of the silver linings of the coronavirus cloud is the focus that has come on to health and well-being. Mental health has still had stigmas despite people being able to talk about it, and some have struggled and some have thrived during this, but definitely a focus on health and well-being going forward will be key. Some of the things that I've noticed that I think will be useful is employers who took a very holistic approach to their employees. It wasn't just about work performance, it was looking at, their life, families, having, a team barbecue with all the family involved, team games, so that you replicate almost the water cooler moments. It's also been very much about leading on it being okay to talk about mental health issues or lack of well-being, and leading from the front has very much been a theme through the year.
The leadership issue I think is really interesting, and Tom, I really appreciate your thoughts here as well, is actually when your workforce is spread across the country, even more so than perhaps even when working across multiple sites, strong leadership and good leadership has been absolutely fundamental to getting businesses through this. How have leaders responded to that change, and how do you think that is going to change when we start to go back into the office? I mean, James mentioned earlier that he could see Fridays not being a very popular day to come into the office. Little things like that are going to create some real leadership challenges. And I think, Tom, so maybe Kimberly first, but then Tom, I think we have a whole new generation coming into the workforce as well that are going to expect some very different things from their leaders. And I'd be really keen for your thoughts on that. But Kimberly first.
I think in terms of what's coming, the people that are coming through, millennials and younger, I think it's very much about they need a purpose. They need to feel that they're delivering something that is meaningful. It goes back to the good old employee engagement techniques that came out of the McLeod report about 10 or so years ago. It's very much about giving them purpose, getting them involved, letting them being heard. I think for me that would encapsulate it.
Tom?
Yeah, and I think build on that point as well. I think from speaking to a lot of our professional services clients, I think, and obviously having both angles from speaking to people up at the director partner level, but equally then having interaction with the kind of junior people they're trying to hire. I think there's got to be a real awareness that there is a massive difference between the working and living arrangements of someone who is up at the senior end of a business and someone who is potentially in, a house share 2 years out of college or university or whatever. I think that just a real kind of, I think that's been a real thing of talking to a lot of the particularly consulting firms we've been speaking to. And I think, again, leading into James's point, I think will mean that certainly I think that there won't be the death of the office to that degree, with people still keen to get in and amongst sort of city life, be that London or elsewhere. And then to the point of, I guess, sort of what the kind of key trends are around sort of Gen Z or millennials kind of moving into the employment market. I think we've always obviously got to be slightly hesitant to kind of make big sweeping assumptions about an entire generation, but certainly all of the research would certainly suggest that there's a couple of quite undeniable kind of points that or traits of those two generations. One being that they are by a long way the most tech savvy, even tech innate of any generation previously, for obvious reasons. But then secondly, that there's a real clamour for flexibility, and that's been the real thing that's come out of all the research. Be that in day-to-day routines and working from home, or flexible hours, through to actual kind of professional mobility. All the stats will say that 3 years is a pretty good stint in a job now out of university as to what it used to be before. And obviously COVID's kind of, particularly on the first one of those, has really forced the hand of quite a few businesses. We're having conversations like this all the time. We're all working from home. But there's a couple of big trends as well that we see, particularly across professional services, that I think are definitely here to stay. Outside of that, and similar to what James was saying, were sort of pre-COVID. One is a real shift within professional services towards skills-based hiring. which basically means potentially forgetting a little bit about what's on your CV, potentially if you went to university, and if then, which university you went to. We saw in the news last week with the Multiverse, sort of big fundraise, Tony Blair's son's startup raised about £30 million, all around sort of looking to remove unconscious bias from a hiring process. Another big trend, I think, as well at the junior end of things, which the consulting firms are probably a little bit ahead of the curve now, but I think we'd certainly expect it to extend into other professional services firms, are really engaging with junior employees on quite a kind of flexible short-term basis a little bit more, i.e. With people looking to try a few more different things before they commit to a career, actually maybe engaging them as part of a flexible workforce in a similar way to a more senior associate pool might at the moment. Those two certainly particularly big trends we've seen across the board.
It's quite interesting, James. A question for you. It's quite clearly going to shape the way an office is used. It's no longer sort of going to be a factory for work, so to speak, but a place where there will be people doing work, wanting to come in every day, perhaps an older generation more comfortable with that sort of office-based experience. There will be the younger workforce coming in that will be there for their training and development and learning, and perhaps 1 or 2 days. How does the office space accommodate, what is effectively maybe 3 or 4 different generations in a workplace all at one time, and trying to meet all of those very different needs of those people? Are we likely to see the office itself change?
I think it goes back to my earlier points on office design. I think there's undoubtedly, as an overall trend, a shift away from kind of individual solo work, which most people are quite happy to do at home, and a shift towards coming into the office for collaborating, meeting with your colleagues and your clients, and as well as socializing. I think that's an important point to bring out. We are social animals, so we like to meet up. So I think the office design will shift to be much more flexible. There'll obviously still have to be an element of individual desks, but you'll continue the trend that we've seen in recent years of hot desking. I'm not a massive fan of the term, but desks that are there to be used by anyone who tends to sit on them. But much more flexible areas, both in terms of formal private meeting rooms for that type of space, but also kind of areas with fitted out in a way that could be used for lots of different things. So benches and cubicles and seats, which are very, very flexible in nature. That would be my take on how we're going to see the office environment change in a much more service-based and kind of a hotel feel to things, in terms of the kind of, as you walk into the reception, it will feel much more service-led than it has done traditionally.
It sounds quite exciting, to be honest with you. But, I think we're rapidly coming to the end of our allotted half an hour, but I've got one final question that I'm going to put to the three of you. I think we've seen, Alastair hinted at the beginning, we've seen an awful lot of research coming out around the future of the office and the future of work. And Kimberly and Tom, I'm going to ask you both the same question. Is there any particular area of research or thought leadership that you haven't seen firms address, or would perhaps like to see firms address? Kimberly, you first.
I'd really like to see a strong collaboration between HR professionals and marketing professionals to turn the focus internally. As you said at the beginning, Matt, we're in a new normal, but we have another new normal to come after we've all been vaccinated. And employees are key to shaping what that looks like, and how they use workspace, how they perform, how they operate. So for me, it's bringing the focus internally.
Tom, anything you would like to see?
Yeah, sure. So I think certainly the impact that the last 12 months and the kind of economic impacts of COVID have had on particularly the junior kind of employment markets and people's trends and reticence or kind of keenness still to switch roles and change, and how that's affecting things, I think would be a very interesting point.
Thank you very much. And Alastair, I was going to ask you the same question, if there's anything that you particularly would like to see.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. If you look at the last, certainly over the last kind of 5 to 10 years, there's been a lot of thought leadership around how particular industries have been disrupted, or particular job roles. So what does the CFO of the future look like? What does the tax function of the future look like? And these are kind of really interesting thought leadership questions and trends. but actually I'd really love to see firms really grapple with how some of these broader trends that we've been talking about impact on some of that kind of disruption at the kind of industry or functional level. And I think, given that these trends are in constant evolution, I think kind of quickly reacting to these changes and giving a viewpoint, I think will be really important for professional firms.